In the initial phases of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the fighting was happening on the ground, with little focus on the aerial conflict in Ukraine's airspace. 8 months into the war, the aerial warfare above Ukraine is at the center of attention. AeroTime sat down with Kurt Volker, former special representative of the U.S. government for Ukraine and former U.S. ambassador to NATO, to discuss actions needed to prevent more airstrikes on Ukraine's cities, the supply of fighter jets, drones and air defense systems, the likelihood of nuclear confrontation, and if winter will affect support for Ukraine. Kurt, thank you for joining us here in AeroTime.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here.
So we're now into month 8 of the Russia-Ukraine war, which started back in February to 2022, and it's prolonged beyond anyone's expectations. Now, could you tell us the current state of the war and where things are today?
Right. It's prolonged beyond anyone's expectations because those Russians just keep fighting. They should just go away. But the state of the war, we've been through a few phases here. The first one was Russia launching this blitzkrieg, if you will, trying to decapitate the government and take over Ukraine very, very quickly. Utter failure. And they were poorly led, poorly planned, poorly supplied, poorly trained. A lot of the soldiers didn't even know where they were when they were captured by the Ukrainians. So it was a complete mess in the first phase. And the Ukrainians let them run out of supplies first, get stuck on the roads, and then gradually move to push them out. The second phase, the Russians then tried to get into some kind of artillery war, a war of attrition on the front lines in eastern Ukraine. And the Ukrainians were very smart about that as well, too. They allowed the Russians to fight and fight and fight and exhaust themselves while giving up just a little bit of territory. And then have part 3, gone on the counteroffensive. And the Ukrainians are now better personnel, better trained, more of them, better equipment, including a lot of provisions from the United States and other countries, better led, better command and control, and the Russians are demoralized. They've had significant casualties, so they're trying to fill gaps in the units. They went through this mass conscription, which is just dragging people off the streets, quite literally, who have no training, experience in the military, and no motivation. They've lost about half the conventional equipment that they had when they started the war. They don't have enough kit for the individual soldiers, just uniforms and flak jackets and things. So they are gradually losing. And Putin tries to keep throwing more resources at this, but the Russians are losing. And they are having to fall back in eastern Ukraine. They're falling back in Kherson province now. And I think you're going to see, before the winter, the Ukrainians make another significant set of territorial callback to take more of their territory back. And then the winter's going to be very hard for the Russian forces because the Ukrainians are doing an excellent job knocking out the logistics. So, and as you know from the aviation industry, logistics is really everything. How do you move goods and people and supplies and ammunition and fuel? And the Russians are losing their ability to do this. Now,
you described this tactical response, three-phase tactical response from Ukraine. But I guess something also to consider is that, was NATO or the U.S. prepared for the war to drag on this long?
Well, unfortunately, no. I think we got a lot of things wrong. We got one big thing right. Putin was going to attack. And we warned the Ukrainians, we warned everybody. But we got several other things wrong. We overestimated the capacity of the Russians. We underestimated the capacity of the Ukrainians. And as a result, we underestimated what we would do and what we should do to help the Ukrainians. And we were very slow at the beginning of the war. We kept saying what we would not do. We won't give them Stingers, and then we changed our mind. We won't give them howitzers, and then we changed our mind. We won't give them these HIMARS, long-range artillery, and we changed our mind. And we keep doing this, so we've been dragged into this. All that being said, we are now at a level where we have provided over $15 billion worth of military equipment to the Ukrainians. They have integrated and used it effectively, and there is very strong support in the U.S. to continue.
Now, just again, taking a look at that support again, the longer the war has prolonged, the more the world has had to adjust to some of the restrictions and measures that we see in the airspace today, such as the no commercial fly zone over Ukraine today. Now, just keeping that in mind, how has that changed the U.S. and Europe's perspective on defending Europe's airspace?
Well, I think several things. First off, it was a mistake and remains a mistake on our part to allow the Russians to close Ukrainian airspace. Ukraine's a sovereign country, it's their airspace, and we have not challenged Russia as they fire missiles and airplanes and so forth in Ukrainian airspace. We should not have done that. Right now, there is no appetite for preventing Russia from doing that now. So this airspace will remain closed for some time. It is an eye-opener, or a wake-up call, if you will, for European countries of the importance of protecting airspace. And what we've seen NATO do, for instance, is reinforce the air policing missions, for instance, here in the Baltic states, and move more forces further forward in NATO states to make sure that all aspects of the security of that country are covered. So the awareness is much higher. And I think that we are now at a phase, finally, where we are providing Ukraine more serious air defense systems, which will allow them to protect their airspace better. And I would say we're probably a few weeks away from seeing them gain real control over that airspace, prevent attacks against cities. And when that happens, I hope that we start talking about opening up at least a portion of Ukraine's airspace for flights in and out again.
And actually, just staying on this perspective or the aspect of security, and also tapping into your history as well, where you served as the special representative of the U.S. government for Ukraine. This was between 2017 and 2019. Years which must have been critical in setting up the defense of Ukraine's air defense for an attack such as this. Now, again, how did the U.S. and NATO prepare Ukraine's Air Force and air defense in those years that preceded the war?
So we did not do anywhere near enough for the Air Force. If you remember, during 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea and Donbass, up until, or through all of 2016, President Obama had a ban on sales of lethal defensive arms to Ukraine. So we would do things, night vision goggles, literally blankets and MREs, but we were not doing any real serious defense support. We were bringing them to schools in the U.S. We were doing training, but not really marrying them up with equipment and helping the Ukrainians with that. Starting in 2017, and this was part of what I was involved with, I pushed very hard to lift this arms embargo on Ukraine. And we managed in the fall of 2017 to get the U.S. administration, President Trump, to decide to provide Javelin anti-tank systems. This was the first crack of opening the door for lethal defensive arms for Ukraine. This provided a pathway then, or it broke the precedent so that other types of lethal defensive arms started coming in. The French provided attack helicopters. We provided anti-sniper systems, which are systems that calibrate where sniper fire is coming from and fire back. So we started doing all of that. Most of what we did was focused on the ground forces and a little bit on the Navy. We gave them some retired Coast Guard vessels for the Ukrainian Navy. Air Force was really mostly about training. And I think we look at that now, I look at that with some regret, because we should have done more on air defense even back then. And once this war started, once this phase of the war started in February, a number of us, General Phil Breedlove, who was a former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, but an Air Force officer, and General Wes Clark and General Ben Hodges and myself and a few other former ambassadors, we argued specifically for more support for the Air Force in Ukraine, giving them some retired U.S. equipment like A-10s, and also more air defenses. And it has taken us here we are in October, and we're still catching up with that.
Mm-hmm. And again, you mentioned earlier that there was that initial reluctance to provide certain military defense. You mentioned the stingers, and then we changed our minds. Now, keeping that in mind, firstly, initially there was that reluctance to provide the Western aircraft due to the fact that it takes months to train or rate Ukrainian pilots on these aircraft. But now the narrative is different. And we see that the Ukrainian service members being trained on heavy weaponry in several Western countries. Now, keeping that in mind, what's your take on supplying fighter jets to Ukraine's air defense?
Right. So let me first address the training point and then come to the fighter aircraft, because my perception is that we have used the duration of training as an excuse. The Ukrainians have fighter pilots. They have people who drive tanks. They have people who work artillery systems. They already know how to do it on their own equipment, former Soviet equipment. And it's not that big a deal to adapt to a different airframe or a different tank. Yes, it requires some training, but you're not talking months and months and months. The Ukrainians are very astute. Secondly, we need to be on a war footing here. Ukraine is fighting for its survival. We shouldn't be saying, oh, but you can't fight to survive until after you go through 3 months of training. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So we have overestimated that, and I think we were using it as an excuse. We have begun to relax that a little bit, and where we are now on the air forces. You'll remember back in March, the Poles were ready to give MiG-29 aircraft to Ukraine, and the U.S. was going to backfill them with U.S. aircraft in Poland, which would create a pathway for Poland to then acquire more U.S. aircraft. Very good policy, very sensible. Secretary of State Blinken announced this when he was in Poland, visiting the Polish government and Ukrainian refugees and the Ukrainian government. It got blocked within the administration after that. We never followed through. Now we are back at a stage where that is on the table again. And it's MiG-29s and also Sokolovs, and it is Poland, Slovakia, and Romania, where people are talking about this. I expect this will now happen. The second thing is U.S. aircraft or Western aircraft. And the most important one here is the F-16, where we have already begun training Ukrainian pilots on the F-16 system. The expectation in Washington is the war will be over before any F-16s are transferred to Ukraine and they're able to integrate them into their Air Force. But I think that is still remains to be seen how this all plays out. But the openness is there. And then the final one, I mentioned the A-10 aircraft. That's a ground attack aircraft that is particularly good at anti-tank and anti-armored columns. And we had already trained 6 Ukrainian pilots to fly these aircraft in Arizona over the past couple of years. And it would be a matter of taking them out of storage and giving them to the Ukrainians, and then making sure they got the associated equipment, for logistical support, parts, maintenance, and ammunition to go with it, that they would be able to use them effectively. Pilots have told me that they are very simple aircraft to fly, and it's really the weapon systems that require the most attention. That does not seem to be on the table at the moment, but I think it's one that we need also to keep bringing up. Because if you can't control the skies, then there's always a risk that the Russians continue to make progress on the ground. We should be giving the Ukrainians as much of a 360 capability as we can.
And that's quite interesting how you said if you can't control the skies, then that gives Russia that openness to progress on the ground as well. Now, and you mentioned earlier about winter, which I think is, with everything that's going on today, it's very important to set up, to make sure that there's the necessary resources ahead of this winter. Now, throughout the war and right from the beginning, President Zelensky has called for Allied support of more anti-air missiles, anti-defense systems as well. And looking recently on October 10, Russia launched one of its largest attacks on Ukrainian cities. This included Caliber missiles, cruise missiles, as well as Iranian-made Shahed 136 suicide drones. Now, recently, several European nations have responded to that and promised to deliver more or air defense systems for Ukraine. How has this allied support and supply of drones and anti-air systems from the US and Europe impacted the trajectory of the war, especially ahead of the winter we're about to enter?
Yeah. So the big thing at the beginning of this conflict was the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone, which was used very effectively by the Ukrainians in going after the Russian armor. And that was already the opening salvo, if you will, the opening of a window that drone warfare is now a thing, and it matters a lot. The Russians were very slow to integrate drones into their attack capabilities. They had surveillance drones, but they were very slow to integrate them as an attack capability. The Ukrainians were ahead of the curve on that. Now, as you pointed out, the Russians have largely exhausted their ability to advance on the ground, and they've largely exhausted their supplies of precision-guided missiles and bombs. So as a result, they have turned to Iran and said, can we buy some of your drones and then we'll use those? This is, in my mind, a sign of Russia's weakness, the weakness of its hand right now, as opposed to a symbol of strength. And the Ukrainians have been able to take out about 80% of these drones and these missile attacks already. And with new air defense systems coming in, that ratio should go up even more. Whether it can ever be 100%, who knows, but they're going to be able to have much better protection against the missiles and the drones that the Russians were able to provide. The U.S. is also providing now drones to the Ukrainians, something we said we weren't going to do, and then we changed our minds. They're called the Switchblade drones, and then there's a new variant that we're bringing in as well. The Switchblades are also eventually kamikaze drones. That you can use them a long time first, though. You can hover, you can gain surveillance, you can attack, and then at the end of the run, then you can also crash into something. That is proving to be very significant for the Ukrainians. The combination of the long-distance surveillance capability and the ability to attack with precision.
And just from your perspective or point of view, what more could the West and NATO do to help prevent more strikes on Ukrainian cities?
Yeah. The number one thing we should do right now is give Ukraine longer-range artillery shells. The shells that we give them now can go about 80 kilometers for a precision strike. We have the capability to do this up to 300 kilometers. This would make a vast difference in Ukraine's ability to disrupt Russian supply lines from way back. Their ammunition depots, their fuel depots, the support for their forces, the Kurt Strait Bridge, the naval base at Sevastopol, airfields in Crimea. They should be able to go after all those things. If they did that, it would be extremely difficult for the Russians to launch the types of drone attacks that they're doing now because of the range of the drones, where they're operating from. They'd force the Russians to pull back further. So it is seen as an offensive capability to give the Ukrainians these long-range artillery shells. We need to reframe our thinking. They're defending their country, so by definition, it's defense. And if they are able to force the Russian forces back, that is actually a defensive mode, not an offensive mode.
Now, talking about long-range strikes or long-range measures, the threat of Russia resorting to a tactical nuclear approach is on everyone's mind.
Yeah.
How likely are we to see nuclear confrontation?
Well, I think it's unlikely, but at least there's some chance, and any chance is unacceptable. So we have to take it extremely seriously. But I'll tell you why I think it's unlikely. First off, you have to rule out strategic nuclear weapons, ICBMs flying across continents. That would destroy Russia. And the Russians know that there would be a response and Russia would no longer exist. So they're not going to do that. Then you talk about the tactical ones on the battlefield that you mentioned. And here, The Russians have not prepared their forces for this. They don't have equipment to protect themselves against radiation, against explosion. The territory in which you did explode such a nuclear weapon would become uninhabitable. And the whole point of Russia's war here is to take and hold territory. They want to conquer Ukraine. They make it unconquerable by using a nuclear weapon. And then finally, the West has been very clear, and this is both the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary Blinken, and also the Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, saying there will be devastating consequences, catastrophic consequences for Russia if there's any nuclear use. And this is a clear warning that there would be a direct military response against the Russian military, which I think is tremendously important. I think the Russians got the message. Means the Russian military will not want to use a nuclear weapon. And it raises a doubt, therefore, whether they would even follow the order if Putin gave it. And if there is such a doubt, then that must also be a concern for Putin, because he can't afford to give an order and have it not followed. So I think that this introduces a lot of uncertainty in the Russian system now, based on the certainty that there would be a response.
And just looking at that uncertainty, I guess on both sides, we're now heading into what some would say is going to be a harsh winter, again, considering rising oil prices, rising inflation, and a lot of talk about a global recession looming. Now, keeping that perspective, do you expect there to be a change in the nature or the volume of support to Ukraine from the West or Europe?
So I guess the short answer to that is I don't expect any such change this winter for several reasons. One, the West Europeans, Germany, France in particular, the UK, Central Europe as well, have done a lot already to harden themselves against Russian energy shutoff this winter. Lithuania is not dependent on Russian energy at all. Germany still is, but they've bulked up their storage. They have contracted for more gas from Azerbaijan. They've went to Qatar trying to buy more LNG. They've contracted for electricity from nuclear power generation in France. So they have positioned themselves to be able to withstand this. Another reason is that Russian war crimes continue to be exposed in Ukraine. And when publics see mutilated bodies, torture chambers, women who've been raped, children who've been murdered, one-year-old dead baby in a mass grave, publics have a willingness to support Ukraine, say this is unjust and unfair. We have to support the Ukrainians even if it costs us a bit more. The worry is what happens next year, because it's one thing to bulk up and get through this winter, but reorienting whole energy systems to be sustainably able to do without Russian oil and gas well into the future, that's a bigger task. And they're starting down that road, but there's more yet to do. And you do hear people, for instance, in Germany, talking more about next winter as a worry point than you hear about this winter. And you mentioned something on the aspect of these Russian war crimes. Recently, we saw Russia, publicly or formally annex 4 regions in Ukraine, and we saw Ukraine respond by its application to become a NATO member, something that Russia had warned against earlier in the war. Now, keeping that in mind, has that changed the U.S. and NATO's point of view of the war? It hasn't, no. And so the question is a little tricky here, because the U.S. and NATO have had a policy in place since 2008 that someday Ukraine can become a member. But there was actually no movement, no progress, no activity, no process for Ukraine to become a member. And when Russia says that, we invaded Ukraine to prevent them becoming a member of NATO, that's just a made-up story by Putin, because they weren't making progress to become a member of NATO anyway. And Putin, in other comments, has made clear that the real reason is to rebuild the Russian Empire. He sees himself as Peter the Great. He said so. He wants to recover Russian lands. He denies the existence of Ukraine as a as a people, as a culture, as a language. It says, oh, they're just confused Russians. So that's what's really going on. So it's not actually about NATO. Now, the claimed annexation of these provinces was rushed through because Putin started to realize he was losing the war. And if he didn't do it then, it would have less and less credibility. And even now, Russia does not control all of the territory of each of the provinces that it has claimed to annex. And they're going to be losing more and more territory. The Czechs did something very funny to make a point of this and saying, well, we've decided that we're going to annex Kaliningrad. They have no control over Kaliningrad whatsoever, but Moscow doesn't control Kherson, so what the heck? So they don't really have much credibility in claiming to annex these territories. And as the Ukrainians liberate pieces of these territories, we're again seeing evidence of war crimes, the local population thankful for the Ukrainians to have liberated them. It gives the lie to Russia's assertion that this was a referendum that people really wanted in order to join Russia. As for NATO in the future, you still have reluctance on the part of the US, Germany, NATO Secretary General, to talk about Ukrainian NATO membership. When Ukraine made this application for accelerated consideration, you didn't get any positive echo from NATO, from the United States. Quite the contrary. There was a lot of worry about NATO grabbing a hold of this because it could change the perception of the war. This is a war of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And if NATO were to jump on this, it could look like it's a NATO-Russia war, which is not the image or the perspective that NATO wants to have. So I don't think it's actually changed anything. It shows that Ukraine wants to join NATO, which is understandable. But in terms of the Western attitude or what Russia's doing, it's pretty much the way it has been all along.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to bring it all together, what's your point of view or your feel on how long the war will prolong from today?
Yeah. Well, here I think the most important thing to consider is that Putin has established military objectives of taking these territories and annexing them to Russia, which he cannot achieve. He doesn't have the military means to do it. And indeed, he's going to be losing ground. As a result, he is grasping for more and more. He's calling up these conscripts who are untrained and incapable and unwilling and throwing them into the fight. He doesn't have the weapons, so he goes and buys drones from Iran or asks North Korea for some help, takes some stuff out of storage in Belarus. So he is declining in his ability to wage this war rather than increasing, and he's not going to be successful. This is creating greater and greater strains inside Russia. When he called up these conscripts, you had more people leave the country than were actually conscripted into the military. So he has clearly pushed the button on strains in society. The sanctions are doing this as well. There's shortages of certain types of spare parts. This isn't going to go on forever. The Russians know this is bad. The elites in Russia know this is bad, and he will not be able to continue doing this. How it changes, we don't know. There's no mechanism in Russia, but it can't continue. So my prediction would be that Ukraine continues to take back territory this fall and next spring, and Russia continues to get weaker and its forces more isolated and cut off from logistics. Something snaps inside Russia, and by this time next year, we'll be looking at a different phase of the conflict again.
Well, Kurt, unfortunately, we have run out of time in our interview, but I want to say thank you for joining AeroTime today and sharing your thoughts and insight on the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure to have you. And that brings us to the end of this AeroTime interview, but stay tuned for more exciting air defense and aviation content. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Jonga, and you've been watching AeroTime. Goodbye.